Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
I'm always excited to see what you all send in, but this one really, really got me thinking.
Yeah.
This is Black Americans and pre-revolution Russia. I mean, talk about a connection that I honestly never even considered.
Right. It's one of those things that, like, on the surface seems totally unrelated, but once you start looking into it, you find all these really interesting connections and fascinating stories.
Yeah. And before we get too far, if you are enjoying these deep dives, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell on YouTube so you don't miss out on future explorations.
I was just going to say that.
Okay, cool, cool. All right, so you sent us this article from UAB Reporter, and it's called "Slavery is a Tie That Binds Blacks and Dissidents in Pre-Revolution Russia."
Yeah.
And it really makes you rethink some assumptions. Who knew that 19th century Russia was a destination for Black Americans? And their experiences there would actually lay the groundwork for the appeal of communism among Black Americans decades later. It's wild.
It's a really remarkable story, and I think it all starts with a figure who really embodies the complexities of this era, Abram Gannibal, an enslaved African boy who was brought to Russia and ended up as the godson of Peter the Great.
Hold on. Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, had an African godson.
Exactly.
That's not something they teach you in school.
Right. And it gets even more complex than that. Peter the Great, was really obsessed with modernizing Russia and challenging Western perceptions of the country.
Right.
He was a huge believer in social mobility, but based on merit, not just on your birthright.
Right.
And so he saw Gannibal as a kind of living proof of this philosophy.
So he was using Gannibal's story to make a point, but wasn't that point completely undermined by the fact that Gannibal started out as an enslaved person?
You're exactly right. That's the irony of it. It's that Peter the Great is trying to promote this idea of a meritocracy at the same time that he's upholding this system that completely devalues Black people.
Right.
But at the same time, Gannibal's story is pretty incredible. He gets a top-notch education, becomes fluent in multiple languages.
Wow.
Rises through the ranks of the military, and even goes to France to study military engineering.
So he really did defy the odds.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
But it sounds like Peter the Great was trying to have it both ways.
Yeah.
Showcasing Gannibal's achievements, but still benefiting from a system built on inequality.
It's a huge contradiction.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, I think, is that statues of Gannibal and his great-grandson, the famous poet Alexander Pushkin, still stand in Russia today.
Right.
That's a completely different historical narrative than what was happening in the U.S. at the time.
Absolutely. It's a stark contrast. It's like Russia was in some ways ahead of the U.S. in terms of acknowledging Black achievement, at least on a symbolic level.
Yeah.
But Gannibal's story is just the beginning, right? There are other Black individuals who found their way to Russia.
For sure.
In the 19th century.
And that's where it gets even more fascinating.
Okay.
So let's move on to Nancy Prince, the free Black woman from Massachusetts who traveled to Russia in the 1820s with her husband.
Okay.
Her experiences there were so different than what she had faced.
All right. I'm intrigued what was so different about Russia for her.
Well, for starters, she found a level of respect and opportunity that was unheard of for a Black woman in the U.S. at that time.
Right.
She establishes herself as a successful seamstress.
Wow.
Employs an apprentice.
Oh, wow.
Even befriends members of the Russian aristocracy.
That is amazing. She was really thriving.
Yeah.
That speaks to her resilience and entrepreneurial spirit, but also it says a lot about the social dynamics in Russia at the time. It sounds like there was more openness to Black people, at least in certain circles.
That's a really good point. Remember, Russia didn't have the same history of plantation slavery as the U.S.
Right.
So the racial dynamics were just completely different.
Right.
But it wasn't a utopia for Black people by any means.
Right.
While Prince was in Russia, she witnessed the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, which was a failed uprising against Tsarist rule.
Now, the Decembrists, for our listeners who might not be familiar, were an early attempt at revolution led by a group of noblemen and military officers who were influenced by Enlightenment ideals and opposed to the autocratic rule of the Tsar.
Exactly. And Prince's experience of this revolt is really important because it exposed her to revolutionary ideas and anti-despotic sentiment.
Now, hold on. Despotic. We should probably define that for our listeners.
Sure.
Despotic essentially means tyrannical or oppressive rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this exposure to anti-despotic sentiment probably really shaped Prince's worldview.
Right.
When she returns to the United States in the 1850s, She's just appalled by the racism that she encounters.
Right.
Having experienced a different social reality in Russia,
Right.
the injustices of American society were even more glaring to her.
It's like Russia gave her a new lens through which to see the world.
Yeah.
And when she came back to the U.S., she couldn't ignore the contrast.
Wow.
Makes you wonder how many other Black Americans might have had similar experiences that shaped their views on social justice.
It's a question worth asking. And it leads us to another fascinating figure, Nicholas Seid, whose story takes us from Africa to Russia, and then surprisingly to the American South.
All right, let's dive into his story. What makes his journey so unique?
Well, Nicholas Seid's story, I think, is really a testament to just the unpredictable nature of life,
Right.
and how our paths can intersect with historical forces in these really unexpected ways.
Yeah.
So originally his name was Muhammad Ali Ben Said.
Okay.
He was the son of an African military leader, captured and enslaved at the age of 14, and after being sold multiple times,
Yeah.
he ends up in Russia in the 1840s.
Enslaved in Russia.
Yeah, so
I thought Russia didn't participate in the transatlantic slave trade.
that's right, they didn't, and that's where Said's story takes this really fascinating turn.
Okay.
Upon entering Russia, he's actually freed.
Okay.
Russia didn't have the same legal framework for chattel slavery as the U.S., and so enslaved people who arrived there were often granted their freedom.
So in a way, Russia provided him with a level of freedom that he wouldn't have had in many other parts of the world
Absolutely.
at that time. What a twist.
It really is, and it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
At the time, having Black servants was considered really fashionable
Okay.
among the Russian elite.
Yeah.
And Said had worked as a valet for a wealthy merchant, so he actually enjoyed
Wow.
more economic freedom and social standing than many Russian serfs.
Wow, that is a perspective I never considered. So here's a man who was born into privilege, then enslaved,
Yeah.
then freed,
Yeah.
and in a strange twist of fate,
Yeah.
found himself with more social mobility in Russia than many native Russians. It's incredible.
Right? Life is full of surprises.
It is, but wait, there's more.
There is.
So after about a decade in Russia,
Yeah.
Said decides to return to his homeland in Africa.
Right.
However, in a last-minute change of heart at the docks,
Right.
he decides to sail to the United States instead. Why on earth would he choose to go to a country with such a deeply entrenched system of slavery after experiencing relative freedom in Russia? It seems so counterintuitive.
It really does, and honestly, it remains a bit of a mystery.
Yeah.
Some historians speculate that he might have been drawn by a sense of adventure or a desire to connect with other people of African descent.
Perhaps he underestimated the extent of racism and discrimination
Yeah.
in the U.S., especially in the South.
It's certainly possible. His experiences upon arriving in the U.S. seem to confirm that he struggles to find work,
Okay.
partly because he has this really strong aversion to manual labor.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
But seriously, it suggests that he had this really strong sense of self-worth
Yes.
and a belief in his own capabilities that kind of transcended his experiences as an enslaved person.
Absolutely.
And this determination ultimately led him to Alabama,
Yeah.
where he takes this really bold step. He opens a school for Black children.
That's incredible.
I know, that's amazing. But wasn't it incredibly dangerous to educate Black people in the American South
Right?
in the mid-1800s?
Right.
That takes an immense amount of courage.
Absolutely. It was educating enslaved people was seen as a direct threat to the institution of slavery.
Right.
So while Said's school doesn't last long,
Right.
it's a powerful testament to his commitment to education and social justice.
His story is so inspiring. But how does his time in Russia factor into all of this? Do you think it had an impact on his decision to open a school?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly possible. You know, Russia at the time was just brimming with this intellectual and political ferment.
Right.
A lot of Russian writers and thinkers were grappling with these issues of despotism, serfdom, social injustice.
Right.
So it's very likely that Said was exposed to some of these ideas during his time there.
So even though his time in Russia was relatively brief, it might have planted the seeds for his later activism?
Yeah.
What's so fascinating is that he seems to have internalized these ideas about freedom and equality and then applied them to the context of the American South.
Exactly. It speaks to the unexpected ways in which ideas can travel across borders and influence social movements in different parts of the world. It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Where a seemingly small event
Yeah.
can have these far-reaching consequences.
This is amazing. Okay, so we've explored the journeys of Abram Gannibal, Nancy Prince, and Nicholas Seid, each with their own unique twists and turns.
Yeah.
But there's still one more figure we need to talk about, Ira Aldridge.
Right.
What's his connection to Russia?
Ira Aldridge's story, I think, is just a powerful reminder of the global reach of racial prejudice and the unexpected places where talent can find recognition.
Right.
So Aldridge was this incredibly gifted Shakespearean actor from New York.
Yeah.
He faced just significant discrimination in the U.S. and Western Europe.
Right.
But his talent was truly appreciated when he began touring in Eastern Europe in the late 1850s.
Oh.
He finds much greater acclaim and acceptance in countries like Poland and Russia.
It's incredible how his talent was finally recognized and celebrated in Eastern Europe after being denied opportunities in the West.
Mm-hmm.
It's a testament to his perseverance, but it's also a sad reflection of the pervasiveness of racism at the time.
It really is. And Aldridge didn't shy away from addressing the issue of racial injustice.
Okay.
As his success grows in Eastern Europe, he becomes increasingly vocal about his opposition to slavery.
Okay.
He would even use his curtain calls to speak passionately about the horrors of American slavery.
Talk about using your voice for good.
Right.
He wasn't just a talented actor. He was a courageous advocate for social change.
He was. And his activism went beyond those curtain call speeches.
Right.
Aldridge was also known to attend these secret leftist meetings in Russia, where he drew parallels between American slavery and Russian despotism.
Wow. So his experiences in Russia seemed to have this radicalizing effect on him.
Right.
He saw in the struggle against Tsarist rule a reflection of the fight against slavery back home.
Exactly.
This is also fascinating. It's like uncovering this hidden history, seeing these connections between Black Americans and pre-revolution Russia that I think most people are completely unaware of. It really challenges our understanding of the past.
Right.
And how seemingly disparate events and individuals can be linked in these surprising ways.
And it's not just about individuals. It's about this convergence of ideas and movements.
Right.
During this period, many Russian writers and intellectuals were using credence of American slavery as a way to indirectly criticize their own government's oppressive policies.
Oh, that's interesting.
So this created a shared intellectual and political space where Black Americans and Russian dissidents could find common ground.
So they were both fighting against systems of oppression, even if those systems looked different on the surface.
Exactly.
It's amazing.